Sir Tamsak. Maraming salamat sa patamsak mo, si Silo Gaming. Hello. Hello, maraming salamat sa patamsak mo, si Silo Gaming. Thank you so much for coming to our live stream. Sir, pwede niyo po ba ako play all? Ha ha ha. Teka lang. Hindi naman talaga ano yan. Hindi, pag sinabing 500 na WH yung panalunan mo, hindi yan magiging 500 si Silo Gaming. Hindi yan magiging 500. Maniwala ka. Yung napalalunan mong 500 watts hour.
Bigyan ka lang ni Dylan ng time.
Mabuti kung merong 100 na totoo niyan. Merong 100 na watts hour na totoo papasok sa'yo.
Hindi siya kasama dun sa ano.
Kaya nga ako, hindi na ako sasali ng mga palaro na ganyan. Wala yan. Ay, sabi sa natin. Ano na po kasi 108 na po WH ko. Hindi yan 500 na papasok sa'yo. Mega shout out host. Maraming salamat sa patamsak mo, Zion Jane. Yesterday's Maraming salamat sa mga patamsak dyan mga guys. Love Cristolos, tamsak dan kuya, tsamba ni tamsak na. Mega love shoutout ni Love Cristilos. Maraming salamat sa patamsak mo, Love Cristilos. Mega love shoutout sa 2 million people inside the house. Himala, kuya. Himala talaga, himala. Napaka-himala. Salamat sa patamsak mong himala. Himala, kasalanan bang humingi ako sa langit ng isang himala? Pangarap ko'y makita kang naglalaro sa buwan. Inalay mo sa akin ang gabing walang hangganan. Di mahagilap sa lupa ang pag-asa. Nakikiusap na lang, himala, kasalanan bang humingi ako sa langit ng isang himala? Mega love shoutout sa 4 million people inside the house. Inalay mo. Elena Park, hello po. Hello, Madam Elena Park. How are you? How are you, Madam? Mega love shoutout sa iyo, Elena Park, and thanks for coming to my live stream for this night. I will give you jacket, Madam Elena Park. Thank you so much, Madam Elena Park. You ask me if I love you, and I talk on my reply. Maraming salamat sa patamsak mo, Madam Inday Alina. Thank you so much for coming to our live stream. You wanna hurt, you wanna sleep, and sleep somewhere to survive. Thanks sa jacket mo, host. Walang problema yan, Madam Elena Park. But who am I to judge you? Still strapped within my brother or sisters. But then the fashions flares again. And sometimes when we dance, the honest is too much. Dan Harang, maraming salamat sa paharang mo, Inday Alina. You can drop your link, Madam Elena Park. And cry. I wanna hold you till I die, until we both break down and cry. I wanna hold you till the fear in me subsides. Okay, dikitan mo si Elena Park, Inday Alina, bakasan mo lang. Hold you endlessly. Harang, 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 harang. Sweetie Gan, harang host. Maraming salamat sa inyong mga paharang mga guys, mga kapatid. Tutulungan kitang malimot mo siya, ibabalik ang dati mong sigla. Tamsak Dan host, maraming salamat sa patamsak mo, Sweetie Guns. Aking gagamutin puso mong sinugatan, sugat na dulot niya'y salawahan. Halata ang lungkot sa iyong mga mata, kahit di sabihin mo, aking nadarama. Ang paglayo niya'y huwag mong ipagdamdam, mabuti nang nalaman siya'y salawahan. Harang ni Christy Luz, maraming salamat sa paharang mo, Christy Luz. Tutulungan kitang malimot mo siya, ibabalik ang dati mong sigla. Aking gagamutin puso mo, sinugatan, sugat na dulot niya'y salawahan. Malilimot mo siya, tutulungan kita. Wow, thank you. Ano yung kanta ni Roel Cortez, tutulungan kita. Mega love shoutout sa 3 million people inside the house. Oh, my heart won't believe that you have left me. I've kept on myself that it's true. I can't get over anything you want, my love, that you can get myself over you. Don't forget to remember me and the love that used to be. I still remember you. I love you. And my heart lies a memory to tell the stars above. Don't forget to remember me, my love. Galing Priya! Yes! Kanta-kanta na lang muna tayo kasi wala tayong magawa. On my walls lies a photograph of you, girl. Do I try to forget you somehow? You're the mirror of my soul, so take me out of my home, that I can get myself over you. Tamsak host, maraming salamat sa patamsak mo, Wapix. Don't forget to remember me and the love that used to be. I still remember you. I love In my heart lies a memory to tell the stars above. Don't forget to remember me, my love. Thank you. That song is one of my favorite songs from the band called Bee Gees. I love that songs Bee Gees. Don't forget to remember me. Mega love shoutouts sa 2 million people inside the house. Aljen Perez, harang host, tamsak po. At sabay dikit na din po sa inyo host. Mega love shout out to Aljen Perez. Maraming salamat sa paharang mo, Aljen. Host, asa di ay imo sound effect, mingaw man. Wala sana ko gipa sound effect, Madam Gans. Kaya ni kanta-kanta pa si host, nilaylay pa si host, Madam Gans. Okay, may jacket ka na, Aljen Perez. Dinikitan na kita host. Balikan kita, Aljen Perez, mamaya. Pagkatapos ng live stream. Feel I'm going back to Massachusetts. Something's telling me I must go home. And the lights all went out in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is one place I have seen. Ligo muna ako kuya. Sige, ligo muna kay parang medyo asim ka na, Inday Alina. Trying to hitch a ride to San Francisco. Gotta do the things I wanna do. And the lights all went out in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is one place I have seen. Talk about the life in Massachusetts. Gotta do the things I wanna do. Host, di muna makatambay po ha. Hihiluto muna ako. O sige, okay lang. Nakita po. Kasi sa GC natin, kay Ma'am Inday Alina po, na live po kayo. Okay. Maraming salamat, Aljen Perez. Okay lang. Host, okay ra, magkanta na ay tugtog, dili CPR. Mas-CPR tana. Mas-CPR. Mas-CPR lagi, mas-CPR. Unsa man imong ipakanta day, Madam Gans? Atong kantahon. They both made to see my way with you. Unsa imong i-request, Madam Gans, nga kanta? Okay. Kay kantaho na to. Kaya alam mo walay lingaw si host. Dito tayo sa sa Star Maker. Okay. Mega love shout out sa 2 million people inside the house. You can request a song. Subukan mo kantang ito. Bukas ang yan. Mega love shout out sa 1 million people inside the house. Message. Hi everyone, sundo by me. Amor. Christmas song. Anong Christmas particular song na pang Christmas, Madam? Kang Jose Maritsan ba yan? Your Eyes, Love Story. Crazy for You. Kumusta ka, aking mahal? How can I tell her? Kung liligaya ka sa piling ng iba, isa pa lamang. Dami nang nag-request sa akin na mag-duet. When you tell me that you love me, kahit kunting pagtingin, hopelessly devoted. Perhaps love, reality. You raise me up how many hours? Bridge over troubled water. Yes, host. Anong kanta ba yan kay Jose Maritsan? Hindi ko rin kasi pamilyar yung mga kanta ni Jose Maritsan. Christmas in our heart. Let's sing Merry Christmas. A perfect Christmas, abe. Try natin kantahin tong yung yung Jose Maritza na kanta. Bisan unsa, yun na, bahala. Okay. Try natin kantahin to. Hey. Whenever I see girls and boys selling lanterns on the street, I remember the child and the manger as he sleep. Whenever there are people giving gift, exchanging cards, I believe that Christmas is truly in their hearts. Let's light our Christmas trees for a bright tomorrow. Our nation are at peace, and all are one in God. Let's sing Merry Christmas and a happy holiday. The seasons may we never forget. The love we had for Jesus, let me him be one to guide us as another New Year starts. And may the spirit of Christmas be always in our hearts. Every prayer and every song, the communities are nights celebrating the birth of our dear Savior Christ. Let love like the starlight on the first Christmas morn lead us back through the manger where Christ the child was born. So come let us rejoice, come and sing a Christmas carol with one big joyful voice. Proclaim the name of the Lord. Let's sing Merry Christmas and a happy holiday. The seasons may we never forget the love we had for Jesus. Let me him the one to guide us as another New Year starts. And may the spirit of Christmas is always in our heart. Let's sing Merry Christmas and a happy holiday. The seasons may we never forget the love we had for Jesus. Let be him the one to guide us as another New Year starts. And may the spirit of Christmas is always in our hearts. Ay, nako, ang taas. Woo. Okay, thank you, Madam Guns. Wow. Mayora sadya, to tasak host, may LS din po si Mama Lizelle Zadya. Okay, okay, okay. Okay, thank you, thank you. Sa ano, sa patamsak mo, Mayora Sadya. Tatamsak din ako doon. Gagamitin ko yung ninja ko. Saglit, saglit. Maayong Pasko! Harang kuya, Trems Vlog. Hi, Trems Vlog. Kumusta, Trems Vlog? Wala na, harang. Ano natin? Pangalawang harang, 150 harang. Hangak host, salamat, hangak ka, angat. Wala naman ko yung kanta-kanta ko. Never rising boys and girls throwing lanterns on the street. Maraming salamat sa patusok mo, Madam 3M's Vlog. Madam 3M's Vlog, ano ba yung ano mo, yung... Teka na. Paano naman ang ano mo be? 3M's Vlog, yung FB mo, i-add kita. Para ako yung mamili ng picture doon. Taas sa ba, oy? Sige, pili kayo ng mga kanta dyan. Kasi yung done. Okay, maraming salamat sa paharang mo. And dahil Lina, mega love shoutout sa 4 million people inside the house. I'm here na. Wow. Andyan na yung magandang host na si 3M's Vlog. Tosok na at sagad pa. Wow! Maraming salamat sa patusok na sagad mo, Madam 3M's Vlog. Ano yung FB account mo, Madam 3M's Vlog? I-add kita. Hi, Sell Ups! Congratulations sa malapit ng mamuni nating kapatid na si Sell Ups. Kaon mga amo host, hukaran sa nako. Sige, pahabhaba sa ng mga hamo ni mo. Sweetie Guns. Sige, ibaba mo yung premiere mo, Madam 3M's Vlog. Sige, tamsakan ko yan. Tamsakan natin yung ano. Okay, yan. Guys, sa mga nandito, tamsakan muna natin yung yung premiere ni Madam Triens Vlog. Grabe naman to, umaga naman to, hindi naman natin to makita. Replay na lang tayo nito, Madam Triens Vlog. Alas 2 ng madaling araw to. Yan. Okay, tamsak na host. Dana, tamsak na. Guys, sa mga nandito, sa mga naka-BG, puntahan muna natin yung premiere ni Trends Vlog. Sa mga di pa dikit ni Trends Vlog, dikitan na rin natin. Tapos mag-iwan tayo ng bakas. Pangat program, 7 p.m. Europe time. Ano ba yan dito sa Pilipinas, madam? Anong oras na yan dito? Yung pangat program mo, Madam Trends Vlog. Ano yung FB account mo, Madam Trends Vlog? Sa mga may gustong lumaki bahay, lapit lang kayo, marami banana. 11 p.m. Pinas time. Grabe naman talaga. Dati hindi naman ganyan yung oras mo, Madam Trends Vlog Maricel Manabat FB ko. Sige. I-add ka, i-add kita, Madam Trends Vlog. Teka lang. Screenshot ko muna. Okay, screenshot na. Done. Woo! Ngayon lang yan kasi may work ako ngayon. Kaya pala. Kasi dati hindi naman talaga ganyan yung schedule mo dati. Tataka nga ako Masyado na kuya general cleaning pag change og oras kuya ingon aron di nako katamsak jud nimo Sunday and Monday 3 p.m. Pinas time. Ayan. Yang time na yan yung dati mong Maraming salamat sa 3 milyon na nandito. Thank you so much once again to Madam 3M's Vlog for coming to our live stream for this evening. Pararamihin ko para mga small YouTuber, iangat ko kayo. Wow. Sana all, busy lang ako dito. Ano yan? Hindi ko maintindihan yung Busy lang ako dito. Kan ko lang work ko dito lang yan. Sige Madam Trends Vlog. Salamat sa pabiji-biji mo dyan, Madam. Ingat ka dyan sa work mo. Palit muna tayo ng anyo para makatamsak tayo mga guys. Makatamsak tayo sa ni 3M's Vlog. Teka lang, 3M's Vlog. 3M's. 3M's Vlog. Yan. Wow, 3K na talaga si Madam. Madam 3M's Vlog. Asan yung premiere mo dito, Madam? Videos. Wala yung premiere. Pasok tayo lang sa live stream ko. Saan ba ako? Forever still. 5 watching. 5 is watching. Yes. Sit from here. Hindi ko makita yung ano mo. Thumbs up. Done host. Lisel Sadya. Okay, okay. Magpapasounds na tayo mga guys. Sa walang CPR na mga tata. Mega mega love shoutout sa 1 million people inside a house. Simpling OFW in Hong Kong, Dan Tamsak with Paharang host. Maraming salamat sa paharang mo. Simpling OFW in Hong Kong. Maraming salamat talaga and thanks for coming to our live stream. Dismal Lifestyle, tamsak po, Sir Host. Maraming salamat sa patamsak mo, Dismal Lifestyle. Thank you so much for coming back again to my live stream to give your wonderful thumbs up. Mega love shoutout sa 1 million people in my house. Mega love shoutout sa 2 million people inside the house. Thank you so much mga guys. And now, back to 1 million. Tamsak Dan kuya, maraming salamat sa patamsak mo, Justia Vlog. Harang. Okay, may paangat program din si 3M's Vlog mga guys. Haba ng harang, guys. Mega love shoutout sa wala ng tao. Harang pa. Harang-harang. Maraming salamat Sel Alp sa imong paglantaw-lantaw dira. Salamat sa paharang Rearc. Thank you so much Madam Trims Vlog sa imong paharang dyan. Makabili na tayo ng brief niyan. Guys, anuhan muna natin, tamsakan muna natin yung premiere ni Madam 3M's Vlog mamaya guys. Pati yung paangat program niya, puntahan natin. Sa mga gustong umangat, gustong umangat. Mega love shoutout sa 2 million people inside my house. Mamaya, mga guys, asa naman kayo? Puntahan muna natin si Madam Trims Vlog, mga guys. Mega love shoutout sa 1 million people in Zara house. Ay, malapit na matapos. Nakarigo, may pakido-kido kapag Thanks sa paharang mo, Madam 3M's Vlog. Salamat sa iyong paharang dyan. Mega love shoutout sa 1 million people na aking ninja.
Kabayan TV, maninig babalik para sa panibagong video. Kwentong doon pinili muna tayo mga kabayan. Alam mo ba, na bago matapos ang taong ito, ang kauna-unahan na ocean-powered hybrid trimaran na gawang Pinoy ay inaasahan na makapaglalayag. Bago matapos ang taong ito, mga kabayan, ito ang kauna-unahan sa buong mundo. Pero bago yan, please like and subscribe. Pindutin mo na rin ang notification bell para lagi kang updated. Kaya bago akong video, maraming salamat po. Ang proyektong ito ay unang ipinahanap sa publiko taong 2018. Samantala, February 2020 ngayong taon ay inanunsyo ng Department of Science and Technology na malapit na itong matapos. Ang proyekto nga ito ay sa pagtutulungan ng Aklan State University with the Maritime Industry Authority, Marina, ng Metallica Shipyard. At sa tulong pinansyan din ng Department of Science and Technology, DOST. At sa taon rin na ito mga kabayan ay available na ito for commercial release. Dinisenyo ang bagong ito na may kakaibang feature dahil mga kabayan, maliban sa regular na makina na ginagamitan ng gasolina, ay kaya nitong gumawa ng mga enerhiya mula sa mga alon sa dagat para makatulong sa pagpapatakbo sa nasabing barko. Sa tulong ng feature na ito ay magiging energy efficient ang barko. Mas bababa rin ang gastos sa pagpapatakbo nito. At hindi lang yan, ay environment friendly pa ito. Tapos naman mga kabayan, iba talaga mag-isip ang mga Pinoy. Ang punot dulo ng ideya at invensyong ito ay si Engineer Jonathan Salvador na siyang may-ari ng Metallica Shipyard. Paano mga kabayan? Kita-kits na ulit sa susunod kong video. Hanggang sa muli, this is Kabayan TV. Siya din lang.
Nagla-live si Tito, pero ano? Tito, it's not good. It's not anymore. It's gonna find it. Coco! Ready up, or I'll pick the low ones here. Okay, and I pick the low ones here, and they will not that. Daddy, sige naman here na. It's run. Go, get it! Get it! Paralyzed. Freak out. Freak out. Freak out. Freak.
Dito na, matutulog na.
Wala lang time.
Walang time, kakapatapos nyo na lang maglaro ng Odyssey, walang time. Higit ka.
No situation. No situation. No situation. Ilan mo yun? No, hindi. Danya mo eh. Hindi mo lang ikaw winner naman eh. If I say no, then no. I got a Zydak. I got a Cubone first. I have a Zydak first. Fine. I got a Cubone first. I got a Dratini first. Get a Pidgey, Wingle, Scyther. Like that. You don't have a Scyther. I just saw a Scyther. Bawal yung mga scene on. Goodbye to Licky Tongue. Your Licky Tongue, Kaka. I have a Licky Tongue. I don't see it. I got Miss Ravia's first. Skarmory. Squirtle Bird. Kitty. Larvitar. Wingle. Pidgey. Dratini. And Cubone. Really help you to do. about you, the tea? Code. No.
The U.S. sends Coast Guard to arrest and sink China illegal fishing boats in South Lake in the Pacific. The U.S. has blasted illegal fishing by China in the Pacific, vowing to deploy a new generation of fast response boats in the region. The U.S. has decided to deploy its Coast Guard after accusing Beijing of foul play in the South China Sea, in waters Beijing sees as belongs to China. Tensions between the two nations have been growing in recent months. The United States has said it would deploy Coast Guard ships in the Western Pacific for maritime security missions, citing illegal fishing and vessel harassment with China. The news was announced yesterday by Robert O'Brien, U.S. National Security Advisor. In a statement, Mr. O'Brien described the U.S. as a Pacific power and said illegal fishing activity by China was a threat to U.S. sovereignty. The security official said, the People's Republic of China's illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing and harassment of vessels operating in the exclusive economic zones of other countries in the Indo-Pacific threatens our sovereignty, as well as the sovereignty of our Pacific neighbors and endangers regional stability. The USCG is strategically homeporting a significantly enhanced fast response cutter, built in a proven Louisiana-based shipyard in the Western Pacific. Mr. O'Brien added the boats would be deployed, in collaboration, with other U.S. allies in the region whose offshore surveillance is more limited. In addition, even more of the boats could be stationed in American Samoa, pending a survey in 2021. The security official said, if the survey is favorable, the United States could further expand its presence in the South Pacific. Ahead of the statement, the U.S. National Security Council tweeted a photo of Mr. O'Brien speaking to American Samoa's Governor Lolo Matalasi Moliga over the phone. The captions claim the conversation was about an upcoming announcement on actions that will advance security and prosperity in the Pacific Islands. China's fishing fleet is thought to be the world's largest. The country operates a minimum of 2,900 distant water boats that fish outside of China's own maritime borders, according to Eco-Business. Earlier this year, Ecuadorian naval forces discovered a Chinese fishing fleet off the Galapagos Islands consisting of around 340 boats. The islands, which are part of the Republic of Ecuador, are ecologically sensitive. The Galapagos Islands are described by UNESCO as one of the richest marine ecosystems in the world. It describes illegal fishing, as well as increased tourism, as one of the main threats to the islands. A law to prevent overfishing in the region was introduced in 1986 and strengthened 12 years later. China's embassy in Ecuador has said it is putting in place new rules to crack down on illegal fishing activity by its vessels and had adopted a zero-tolerance policy.
Oh, that's easy. Mommy said yes. Fine, but I
China angry, the U.S. approves sail drone weapons ready to Taiwan for stability in the South China Sea. The U.S. State Department has cleared the potential sale of 4 weapons-ready aerial drones to Taiwan. The $600 million United States dollars, $833 million deal would be the first such sale since the Trump administration moved U.S. policy on the export of sophisticated and closely guarded drone technology. The move is likely to infuriate China, which regards Taiwan as a renegade province and has reacted angrily to previous announcements about weapons sales to the island. The U.S. State Department's formal notification gives Congress 30 days to object to any sale, which is unlikely given broad bipartisan support for the defense of Taiwan. This proposed sale serves U.S. national, economic, and security interests by supporting the recipient's continuing efforts to modernize its armed forces and to maintain a credible defensive capability, he said. The proposed sale will help improve the security of the recipient and assist in maintaining political stability, military balance, economic and progress in the region. It said the sale would improve Taiwan's defense by bolstering its intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities and could help deter military action against them. The 4MQ-9C Guardian drone, made by the Californian company General Atomics Aeronautical Systems, will come with associated ground stations, spares and tanks. While the drones can be armed, they will be outfitted with surveillance and equipment. Just last week, the U.S. government approved plans for a $2.37 billion United States dollars sale of Hug-2 missile systems to Taiwan. That came hours after Beijing announced sanctions on U.S. defense contractors, including Boeing, the lead contractor on the Hug-2 over a previous weapons deal. In response to the sale, China's Ministry of National Defense said on October 27, China strongly urges the U.S. side to immediately withdraw plans of arms sales to Taiwan, cease U.S.-Taiwan military contacts, and stop selling weapons to the island. China's ruling Communist Party claims Taiwan, which split with the mainland in 1949 during a civil war, as part of its territory and it has threatened to invade it. Washington promised in the 1980s to reduce and eventually end weapons sales to Taiwan, but insists its dispute with Beijing must be settled peacefully. Chinese-U.S. relations have plunged to their lowest level in decades amid disputes about security, technology, the pandemic and human rights. Taiwan has long been an irritant in relations. Washington has no formal relations with the island's democratically elected government, but is its main ally. U.S. law requires the government to ensure Taiwan can defend itself. Weapons sales to the island have increased in quantity and quality.
Start bigatin, kita ay bigatin. Biig pa lang, mag-Binig Premium Super Biig na with Bansot Buster Nutrient. Para iwas bansot ang biig, Binig Premium Pre-Starter. Bigatin ang
If real-world politics and US aren't a factor, could Australia withstand a hypothetical Chinese attack? Chinese armed forces number 2 million, dwarfing Australian 58,000. Chinese have some 2,000 various ballistic and cruise missiles. Their air forces feature 19 times more combat planes. Of course, it's the naval might that would count the most, but Australian fleet has 10 times fewer combat ships and submarines. Still, could the vast distance protect Australia from Chinese military might? While this video talks of a modern conflict, you can check out what both sides had in World War II, courtesy of War Thunder, a free military vehicle combat online game, sponsoring this video. The game features an astonishing arsenal of over 1,200 historically accurate and playable tanks, aircraft, helicopters, and ships from 1930s to 1990s. The September update to the game offers China as a playable nation. Not only are the World War II vehicles available, but Cold War machines which China still uses today can also be played, like the J-7 fighter or Type 69 tank. You can try out various Australian systems, such as the Boomerang fighter or Leander-class cruiser. The game is free to play. It is also cross-platform between PC, PS4 and Xbox One. So check out War Thunder, I like it a lot, and the sponsor is offering a premium tank, aircraft or ship, and 3 days of premium account time if you register via the link in the description below. So give the game a try. But let us get back to the Chinese invasion. With technological advances of the recent decades, China has overtaken the Aussie forces in number of high-tech systems as well. Yet, even with all that military might, the Chinese first have to bring their forces to Australia in order to attack it. First order of business would be to ensure the Chinese invasion fleet actually gets to Australia alive. Chinese have a problem there. If they're to just go down the straightest route, their fleet, vast as it may be, would get intercepted by Australian aircraft. Even though on paper China has many more planes, they have only one aircraft carrier. So in actual local terms, near Australian coast, Chinese would be outnumbered. Granted, a second Chinese carrier is very close to being commissioned. But even if that happens within a month, the crew isn't ready and trained, and there's been no indication that an air wing exists, let alone that it is ready and trained. So it's more likely that second carrier would not serve as an actual aircraft carrier before 2021 or so, and would thus be used as a helicopter carrier for assaults and ocean or anti-submarine patrols, as those crews could be moved out to the carrier more easily. So what routes would be available to the Chinese? Since Australia doesn't get US help, China would either have to go around third-party countries' borders or forcefully go over their airspace. That means the Strait of Malacca is off-limits to the Chinese, as it's controlled by 3 different countries. Also, looking at Indonesian territorial sea borders, it becomes apparent Chinese fleet would have to go far east to avoid it. But going that route means crossing over 5,000 miles just in one direction. While ships could go that far if supported, it becomes very hard for aircraft and missiles to go down a similar route. Even with in-air refueling, Chinese planes simply cannot reach that far in meaningful capacity. Chinese might have the option of trying to forcefully sail their ships through Indonesian archipelago, but it's unlikely such a move would be worth the effort. With countless islands and narrow gaps between them, any possible Chinese ship would face sea mines, missiles, and even artillery rounds fired from the land. That's without even going into dealing with the Indonesian Navy, which, while smaller than Chinese, is still numerous enough that hiding around small islands could pose a continued threat. Indonesian submarines, while not top of the line, are also perfect for ambushes on that route. On home turf, Indonesian Navy would have better availability of their ships in the combat theater compared to China, which would have to sail a few thousand miles just to get to the fight. China would have to invest considerable assets into just controlling the Indonesian seas, probably requiring taking control of certain islands along the route and turning the whole conflict into a full-blown war against Indonesia. And in order to sustain the invasion of Australia, such routes would have to be kept secure for over a year or more, taking up dozens of ships and hundreds of aircraft that would otherwise be used against Australia. What would be doable for China, though, is forcing their way over Indonesian airspace. That would shorten the distance their bombers and missiles need to cross. Indonesian air defenses are a modest threat to the Chinese. While most of the air defense assets are shoulder-launched SAMs that can't reach the altitudes the Chinese would fly at, a few ships and land batteries could pose some threat. Then again, with a huge area of Indonesia, it's unlikely many Chinese planes would get to fly over those SAMs. A more serious threat would be Indonesian Air Force. It numbers some 40 proper fighters and several dozen trainer-class planes. The latter might pose some threat against patrol planes and transport planes, which Chinese would have to use a lot. Indonesia would have several routes to defend over a large area, so it's likely Chinese incursions would never be threatened by more than a dozen or two planes. China has a vast fleet of satellites that could somewhat monitor the relocations of Indonesian air forces. But Chinese would still have to waste 24 planes or more for each serious entry through the Indonesian airspace. To fire cruise missiles from their H-6 bombers or send early warning and maritime patrol planes, transport planes, etc. Another route that would be likely is through Papua New Guinea. It would shorten the trip a little bit and there would be barely any threat. Papua New Guinea has but a token military force and no combat navy, air defense or air force to speak of. But what is even needed to perform an invasion on Australian mainland? China couldn't afford a heavily opposed landing. Even with all the landing fleet China has, the numbers would be but a fraction of what Australia could respond with. Transport by air would be hard to do, as current Chinese transport planes lack in-air refueling option. Only larger Illusions and Y-20s could help with paradrops. But going over Indonesia with precious paratroopers would first require weeks of hunting down Indonesian air forces to minimize the risk of interception, and still a sizable fighter escort with every overflight. Flights would not go unnoticed. Australia has several early warning over-the-horizon radars. While they can't identify contacts, they would surely pick up large formations of planes or ships. They're also sufficiently far away from Australian coastline that most of them are safe from missile strikes. China currently lacks submarine-launched long-range cruise missiles, but does have a dozen or so ships which may be carrying several useful missiles per ship. What China would likely do is use vehicle launchers set up on various ships, possibly commercial ones. Both US and China train for similar concepts, and Chinese could reach quite a bit into Australia from such ships. Still, those ships themselves would be under some threat, and even if a few hundred missiles are fired, with all the other important targets, number of missiles hitting the radars may not be enough to repeatedly inflict damage to the radar network. Over-the-horizon radars are huge sites, each covering hundreds of meters, so replacing damaged components would not be out of the question. Australia would rely on other assets as well, primarily aerial sensors, tasked with trying to track those incoming Chinese fleets and provide enough warning. If China goes over Indonesia, route might be open for Australian cruise missile strikes on those Chinese South China Sea island bases. In-air refueled F-18s could thus keep those bases harassed for several days or weeks. Chinese have very long-range air-launched cruise missiles, but those come with their own issues. Only H-6K bombers can carry them. Most of them have barely the range to use them on northern edges of Australia. There is a very small number of H-6 bombers in active service that can receive fuel in air, so Chinese could not perform a rain of missiles on multitude of targets at once. Blocking most of Australian air bases and converted airports simultaneously would not really work. Most Chinese conventional ballistic missiles lack range to reach Australia. Only DF-26 reaches some of Australia, and even that requires launches from the contested Chinese islands in the South China Sea. All of their longer-range models are strategic missiles with nuke warheads only, and nuclear weapons are outside the scope of this video. China could try to repeat the trick with loading the missile launcher vehicles on ships and getting a bit closer. China would also very much go for all the distant Australian islands, as those can act as Air Australia in the region. And once that happens, Chinese Navy might slowly inch towards Australian coast. While there are many islands out there, 3 are particularly interesting, as they are far away from Australia, so Aussies would need a lot of resources to protect them. Yet they offer favorable landscape and existing infrastructure. Chinese would likely try a two-pronged approach. Coco and Christmas Islands might see ballistic missile strikes and limited cruise missile strikes, coupled with strikes by short-range land attack missiles from nuclear submarines. Going all around Australia would slow conventional subs that hold limited supplies is a no-go. Yet Chinese nuclear-fueled subs could sail at a great speed and with roughly 90 days of endurance could be very useful around those islands. Chinese nuke sub fleet isn't large, but compared to Australian assets, it might be a serious factor. Roughly a third of the fleet might be available on station near the islands. And the 094 class would not likely be used in offensive actions, but as silent sensors to aid in early warning of incoming threats. Australia would have to divide their assets to two very distant war theaters, and also keep some for protection of northern mainland, as well as to keep Chinese from going for Tasmania. China going for Norfolk Island in particular means most of Australian Navy would need to go there as well, if there's a chance of stopping the Chinese. Australians could keep the planes on the outer islands and risk getting them destroyed or trapped on the ground by missile strikes. Or they could send them for the mainland, but in that case only a small number of planes could be on station, negating Australian numerical advantage. Australian air tanker fleet is fairly modest. Two-thirds of it might hope to offload fuel for some 50 or so planes, and planes without refueling would not have the persistence for fighter patrol, but they may be used for strikes on maritime threats. Chinese force going for Cocos and Christmas Islands would have it equally hard. They would face some losses from Indonesia, including tankers which would have to refuel planes over Indonesian territory. Chinese air tanker fleet is fairly small, and supporting the fighters going for Western Islands, most jets would need to receive fuel twice, so they're likely to allow for strike packages of a few dozen planes at a time. Even then, their persistence over the islands would be short. It would be comparable to Australian planes sent from the mainland, or much less if Aussies risk and base their planes on Western Islands. Aussie Super Hornets could likely more than hold their own against any Chinese plane, short of the stealthy J-20s. F-35s are even better, but there are very few of them. Australian fleet capable of air defense is not numerous. Two newest destroyers offer long-range protection, and 9 more frigates offer limited area protection. Australia would also rely on its fleet of anti-submarine helicopters, operated from those islands or even from flat tops if needed, in addition to potent Orion and Poseidon ASW planes. Still, those fleets would be divided between a few theaters. That being said, 10 such aircraft and helicopters patrolling the seas would make the life of Chinese nuke subs very complicated, negating much of their edge. Still, the Chinese would be coming in numbers, and Australian planes and ships would slowly get attrited, so the outer islands would surely see invasion attempts. Tune in to our next week's video to see how would the invasion of those islands and possibly Australia proper go for the Chinese. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together. Previous video showed the initial stages of a war where China would try to reach Australia. No outside interference was assumed. These 3 distant Australian islands would likely find themselves under constant Chinese attacks. Air war and naval war would rage until one side breaks. Both sides operate dedicated standoff electronic jamming planes. Australian fleet is a known quantity, while exact number of Chinese planes is vague, as they're dual-use planes, also used for combat. The air war outcome would be crucial for the course of the conflict. Chinese military is already powerful, but with the Cold War brewing, who knows how capable will it get in the future? Even years ago, germs of the incoming clash with China were visible. A very interesting documentary, China vs. USA, Empires at War, shows how each side viewed the possibility of a future conflict. I've watched it on Magellan TV, a new type of documentary streaming service, which is sponsoring this video. It was founded by filmmakers. The producers and curators bring together premium content. I personally like history, technology, and warfare stuff, but you can find quality videos on a bunch of other themes, like the nature, culture, or various biographies. The Empires at War deco struck me as a bad omen of things to come. Other documentaries, like the Titans of War, talking about tank evolution, were also in-depth, yet accessible. Streams feature no ads, and you can use the service on your TV, laptop, or phone. Binkov's viewers get a special offer too. Just go to magellantv.com/Binkov's Battlegrounds and get a 1 month free membership trial. Check it out. Let us get back to the air war down under. Australia would likely enjoy greater radar coverage, not just due to their OTH radars, but the surface radars on and around the outer islands, as well as the AWACS-like planes. While Chinese fleet is much larger on paper, their persistence would be minuscule. Of the listed ones, only the larger four Illusion-based planes have the reach to stay over Christmas Island for a few hours. It would all mean Chinese might fare worse in situational awareness over the Western Islands, and air combat might incur greater losses for the Chinese, despite the relatively advanced fighter jets they would send to battle the Australian F-18. Australia would likely be able to put thousands of troops on those islands and keep the islands restocked, but the surface fleet is likely to suffer. China would use its naval H-6 bombers to perform maritime strikes, aided by their long-range radar planes. It might not be enough for both islands, though. Chinese assault on Christmas Island would thus have to be performed without ships, meaning with paratroopers only. They could only hope the missile barrage would neutralize Aussie defenses enough so the paradrop succeeds. Chinese Airborne Corps is pretty big, but it's limited here by not being able to use its medium-class planes. But Australia lacks proper ground air defenses completely. It has a single air defense unit armed with fairly short-range systems. So whatever ships survive Chinese attacks, and whatever planes manage to be in the air during the paradrops, would be defending the skies, which may initially be some, but Chinese could afford to repeat their attacks several times, not actually sending the transports until they thin out the defenders. Since the islands are small, putting 10,000 troops for defense on them is out of the question. That would only lead to numerous deaths due to target density, while Chinese missiles fall all around. Plus 10,000 defenders per island means there would be barely any experienced troops left defending mainland Australia. At the same time, the Eastern Front would be perhaps under even bigger pressure. The Norfolk Island would be very much under siege, but the Chinese force composition would be different there. The island is slightly closer to Australia, and China would have fewer planes. Basically, they would only have their single carrier, which could serve for several months before having to return home. But it would be there, close by, so actual persistence of Chinese planes over target might be comparable to what Australia can send from that island. Chinese carrier jets are weaker than Australian Super Hornets, roughly as capable as Australian earlier legacy Hornet fleet. Chinese would enjoy some pretty good radar coverage though, with numerous ships and their radars, as well as a dozen helicopter-based aerial early warning units. The Chinese advantage there would indeed be their navy. Chinese would likely send whatever they can to that front. Chinese fleet is pretty big, but the trip they would make is also big. They would spend some 2 weeks in one-way transit alone, leaving a few months on station, and they would need to be resupplied as they reach Papua New Guinea. But Chinese resupply fleet has been gaining ships in recent decades. Their sole carrier has enough range to operate for some time before being refueled. Their other ships would usually require 2 or so refuelings per deployment. Still, even with all the amphibious assault fleet and submarines, the Chinese would have enough supply ships to serve them close to Australia. Conventional submarines would take their time though. Going on average just 7 knots, they would need 3 to 4 weeks just to get to the battle theater. But they are important enough so Chinese would likely wait for them to begin their mission. Parked around Norfolk Island, they would force Australians to use a lot of their aerial anti-submarine assets, and would endanger Aussie ships protecting the island, eventually enabling Chinese fleet of air defense destroyers to cut off the island from Australia, and finally facilitate Chinese invasion of the island. Of course, all of that would come at a steep cost to Chinese. Many ships, possibly a few dozen, would be lost in the effort by the time Australian Air Force isn't a factor anymore. But at the same time, after half a year or more, Australian Navy would be all but destroyed in the effort to deny those stepping stone islands to China. Its air force would probably be halved, and its stock of long-range cruise missiles would be depleted. The reason for all this island hopping instead of landing near Sydney right away is that even the big Chinese Navy can't perform Normandy-style mass landings so far away from China. Whole Chinese assault fleet is still insufficient for a single wave attack on Aussie mainland. A single cycle of Chinese ships going to Australia and returning home for a fresh load would take 3 to 4 weeks. depending on the route and exact point of landing. This still limits landings to a fairly small part of Australian northeastern coast. Even if Chinese manage to have almost the entire of the landing fleet available at start, average availability of the ships through such multi-month campaign of going back and forth would drop. Without a taken port, most of those landing ships would be ferrying supplies for existing troops, rather than fresh forces. Now let us look at what could oppose them. Regular troops shown are professionals. Active reserves are troops serving and training part-time, roughly equal to U.S. National Guard. And standby reservists don't train much and feature limited readiness. For comparison, Chinese Marines and paratroopers would be among the more elite parts of their army. Each side would have certain issues to overcome. Australia would have to have forces defending at least 2,000 miles of coastline. Spreading those forces might not be prudent in such a case. Even though with mass mobilization, Australia wouldn't likely add a few tens or hundreds of thousands of lightly armed troops, ex-civilians with little experience. Having bigger force groups farther away from the shore at certain points might be the way to go, because it's unlikely Chinese landing would be a complete surprise. But with smaller islands taken first, China would slowly bring in the front line to Australia. Eventually, China is likely to win control over the three outer islands and invade their Australian mainland from several sides. Australia would by that point be pretty much mobilized. That means the initial tens of thousands of soldiers would be augmented by roughly 5 to 10% of the entire population, probably closer to 5%, as 10% was achieved only by few countries back when nationalistic spirit was high during World War II. The great majority of those troops would however be very lightly armed. Australia would surely somehow buy assault rifles and basic equipment from the black market. But getting larger and more complex equipment takes time in no allies environment of this scenario, where each purchase goes through the foreign manufacturers rather than through foreign governments. China would have an upper hand there, with their military receiving domestic-made weapons. But China would not be able to enforce a blockade, even if it held those outer islands and turned them into temporary bases for some of their ships. Australia is simply too large to be surrounded by a blockade, and there are too many commercial ships passing through the area to inspect them and block them, without pissing off most of the third-party countries. Time would work in Chinese favor though. With those outer islands taken, Chinese could construct ports on them and use commercial-grade shipping to haul in supplies and arms on a large scale, using upwards of 20 large ro-ro ships. After 12 to 18 months, Chinese might be ready for the second stage of their invasion, threatening the beaches of mainland Australia. Even with over 1 million soldiers, covering all the areas would be impossible. Chinese invasion would by that point also include a better part of their total land forces. Various militia and reservists would also likely be mobilized. As Chinese bring in fresh planes and ships and base them fairly close, Australian Air Force would be on the losing side, relegated to occasional harassment strikes. By that point, Australian Navy would likely be destroyed for the most part. China could still choose whether to go for mainland first or to keep slicing away, taking some other islands. That first island up in the north, and especially Tasmania in the south, might be targets of choice for China. Again, putting 500,000 of Australian soldiers in Tasmania to make sure Chinese invasion fails likely means those soldiers get trapped on the island, as Chinese Navy parks itself in between and cuts the island off. So the likely outcome is that Tasmania would get lighter protection and would eventually fall, even if it takes some more months and tens of thousands of Chinese casualties. With such a large island and its infrastructure, China could bide its time and create a force for one final push, even if it meant Sydney or Melbourne get surrounded by Chinese troops 2 years after start of the hostilities. Whatever heavy weapons Australia could muster and buy in the meantime would still not be enough compared to what China could steadily land all around the country, even if Australia managed to purchase a few times more vehicles than it has today. The million new Australian soldiers may get decent training when it comes to individual combat, but scaling up training to brigade-sized units with combined heavy arms would likely be lacking, as Australia would lack the seasoned officer numbers and heavy systems to take advantage of the combined arms offensive. Chinese edge in satellite surveillance and their numerous fleet of drones and recon platforms would mean they would get to choose where to disembark, taking areas which are not as heavily defended. Chinese air support and fire support edge would then ensure those disembarked troops would stay on the beach. and slowly build up their numbers. Within 2 years, it's likely Australia would be cut up in isolated areas under Australian control and vast swaths of land without any troops. So, a multi-year war would result in total Chinese victory. The scale of two economies and the imposed rule of no allies make sure of that. But it's also important to note that China would run into great problems in the first year of the conflict, even with the no allies rule. If a one-year limit is imposed, Chinese victory would then be labeled as a minor one due to excessive Chinese casualties. And if no other countries are passable, such as Indonesia, then Chinese options would get severely limited, and Aussies could concentrate their defenses in one spot. In such an event, it would take even longer for China to make meaningful gains. And remember, Rearc may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together. The combined might of Russian and Chinese Air Force swoops down on Japan and limited US presence that is there. Thousands of missiles paralyze the forces on Japanese islands, and US island bases such as Guam are faced with the incoming enemy naval fleets. But the US military is vast, its navy is huge, with far more carriers. Could the US hold onto its Pacific bases against such an enemy? And what would the US retaliation look like? First, a word from our sponsor. War Planet Online is a free-to-play real-time strategy game where you place your base on a detailed real-world map. Here's my base where I'm currently working on expanding my army. I'm located right next to Washington. The level of detail is really fascinating. Here are the capitals of the countries we'll be discussing in this video. If your faction is strong enough, you can capture all of them. You can engage in epic real-time battles against other human players, move the borders, claim the region, or even conquer the whole world. The game lets you choose commanders and craft powerful items. You pick your strategy, build up your base, gather resources, forge alliances, and conquer lands. The units in-game are inspired by real-life weapon systems, armored, assault, and aerial units, all of which can be upgraded. Click on the link below to try out War Planet Online. We have also prepared a special surprise, so watch out for the wink of puppets in-game. Let's go on with our Great Pacific Brawl. Mind you, this is a hypothetical war analysis. To keep it simple, there is no prep time, no nukes, no allies. Every other country is fully neutral. What does that mean for US forces currently in South Korea? Well, they're to relocate to Japan. In doing so, they would raise the US forces in Japan by quite a margin, both in army and air force numbers. Being in alliance, Japan would quickly be giving the US access to any bases it might need, including setting up new ones, using existing commercial airports, etc. Japan itself doesn't have a terribly large air force, but it would have to do, at least until US gets to send the reinforcements. The US would not be the only one without a full military presence at the start of the war. Russian military is mostly positioned to fight the war in Europe, so most of its air forces would need to relocate to the east first. Only a part of its naval fleet is in the Pacific. Indeed, the Baltic and Black Sea fleets are unlikely to even participate. They have a lot of non-ocean going ships, and even the bigger ships would be unlikely to survive the trip. The US Navy, much more suited to ocean operations, would likely intercept them. Neither Baltic nor Black Sea fleet are particularly potent on their own. The northern fleet would come in handy though, but it might need time to get to Bering Strait, depending on the time of the year. Of course, actually going through the strait in the face of US forces would be another issue. China too is large enough so that it would need to shuffle its air forces at least a little bit, so most of them are in the position to attack Japan. Initial Chinese and Russian air forces close to Japan would still be a few times bigger than US and Japanese ones. But the composition of those forces is an area where China and Russia fall behind, as they don't have as many advanced fighters. The US has more stealthy planes, and more planes equipped with modern phased array radars, while Once all those do come in, the red side would better be already in possession of some of the Japanese islands if they are to succeed in throwing out the US out of Japan. The US has more long-range bombers, though the Russian Tupolev 22M and Chinese H-6 fleet sort of make up for that, as most of Japan is fairly close within the bomber range. Specialized ground attack plane numbers are slowly dwindling on both sides, though the US does have more A-10s. All the figures so far did not include some of the specialized strike planes the Russians and Chinese use, but that mostly means those are old planes, unable to do multiple roles. Further issue for the red side is that they would have fewer precision strike bombs, and other assets such as targeting pods. Their air forces are more geared towards air combat and aren't as focused on providing ground strikes. Another issue would be distance. Most of the air bases on mainland Japan would be out of range for most of Red Side's planes. The Reds have only a limited number of aerial tanker planes. Pilot training hours is an area where Russia is behind, though the Chinese are getting close to the US Air Force hours due to Pentagon financial cutbacks of the last decade. Luckily for Russia and China, they do have a large number of various ballistic and cruise missiles, which might be brought within hours or days to launch positions, possibly a week for some of the farther away Russian Iskander units. Russian missiles could have the Hokkaido island in range. Exact range of Iskander is not known. While the export variant is limited at 300 kilometers, the Russian variant might be, due to the INF Treaty, limited to 500 kilometers. Chinese missiles are more plentiful, but due to the distance to Japan, would have a harder time reaching some targets. Most of their missiles might not reach Tokyo proper, for example. Moving some to Russian territory near the sea might help, though. Given how the cruise missiles have a range of well over 1,000 miles, another 2,000 missiles might reach anywhere in Japan. Targets such as Guam and even Wake Island could be in reach of air-launched cruise missiles, but in reality, most of those missiles would be more effectively used on targets in Japan proper. Missile strikes are a game both sides can play. While Japan is mostly devoid of such offensive weapons, the US does have quite a few already in the vicinity, with the US Air Force probably getting more and more as the first week progresses. The US Navy does have a lot of Tomahawk missiles, but actually getting US ships to Japan would take a while. Some ships would not even be available due to maintenance. That does apply for all three sides. The Pacific is huge. Bringing the US East Coast fleet could take up to a month. Getting from San Diego to East China Sea would take a week and a half, once the fleet is ready to sail out, which for part of the fleet, especially big-ticket items like some carriers, would not even apply. Looking at US carrier deployments, it would be plausible that 3 carriers would be somewhat close to Western Pacific. 3 more would be near base, ready to sail out within a week or 2. But 4 more carriers would simply be unavailable as they're undergoing complex refueling and overhaul that can take a few years. 1 more carrier is brand new and might take some months to be rushed into a combat mission. Out of those 5, 2 could perhaps join the active Navy by the summer of 2020, speeding up their return to active status due to the war. By 2021, more could join the Navy. Similar issues beset other ships for all navies. The larger the ship is, the longer the maintenance. Though the nuclear refueling is the worst culprit there, so the US carriers are especially hit. Chinese Navy is somewhat less influenced, as it doesn't have as many large ships and most of its ships are new, so most of them haven't required complex overhauls. The Russian Navy, however, does have quite a few ships undergoing such overhauls, including its sole aircraft carrier, which would not be available anytime soon. Near their shores, the Red Side's Navy does outnumber the initially present Blue Side Navy, and in theory, they could try and support some invasions on some of the Japanese islands. Just to note, while China does have 2 carriers, it has only 24 planes between them, and 1 carrier is brand new, needing some months to get into proper action. But it's likely the 2 Russian fleets would never get to meet. Bering Strait is far away from most of the Russian air bases, and without much Russian air cover, the US Navy and Air Force presence around the strait would be too much for the Russians. Still, they would tie up a sizable portion of the US Navy, making the Blue Side unable to go after Chinese Navy in full force. The Chinese fleet would be too far away to join the Russian fleets, as it would first have to fight its way through the first and second island chains, or even worse, try to fight their way through Tsushima Strait. That choke point is so narrow that it's unlikely the Chinese fleet could survive crossing it, with all the US assets being flown in. Japan already possesses a sizable fleet of aircraft that could attack ships and submarines in such a tight strait. The US has a few dozen aircraft in place and could probably fly in dozens more before China manages to assemble its fleet. Actually, when it comes to special mission planes, the US and Japan are likely to keep their edge throughout the whole war. There are just so many of those at disposal. Russia and especially China are still behind in that regard. That extends to aerial early warning planes as well, though it would take more time for the US to send in planes and then match and overcome the initial numbers of AWACS aircraft Russia and especially China would field. The Japanese Navy would also come into play right away before the US reinforcements arrive, and it's quite large, with an accent on anti-submarine warfare, while lacking a bit in anti-air defenses for its size. But at the start, the Chinese and Russian Pacific fleets would outnumber the Japanese and Americans, especially in submarines, though US subs are on average newer and more capable. Still, most of Red Side subs are advanced enough to pose a serious threat. Ships-wise, assuming a few US carrier groups are close by, the difference would be smaller. While the Russian fleet is quite old, the Chinese one is for the most part new and should be capable. But even those figures, where the blue side is behind, would not mean the red side could simply sail east of Japan, combine their fleets, and cut Japan off. The air power present would confine both the Chinese and the Russian fleet to their areas. Indeed, for the Reds to proceed into the ocean, the first island chain would need to be taken from the blue side. Ryukyu Island, in particular, would be one of the most important battlefields. There are many islands there. The more there are, the harder it is for blues to hold onto them, as the attacking Chinese could pick and choose which islands to attack in which order, while the blue side would have to defend every one. Certainly though, the ones closer to China would be easier to take, while ones close to Japanese mainland would be very hard to take. Also, most islands don't have military presence, so for some there would be a race deciding who can disembark forces on them first. Due to the overwhelming presence of Chinese forces near their coastline and feeble blue numbers at the start of the war, it's likely the southernmost islands would be occupied fairly quickly by China. China does possess sizable assault forces. Its amphibious assault forces alone number 30,000 personnel. Coupled with paratroopers and helicopter air assault, that figure could be doubled. But a third of that number would not be maneuver unit combat troops. US currently has one Marine division in Japan. Japan itself has one small amphibious assault and airborne assault brigade. Of course, more would be on the way, but for the US Marines, it would take weeks or a month to fully assemble. And actual ships with which the US Marines could react and go retake islands present in Japan are enough for just a few thousand troops. Again, weeks would be needed for more ships. Chinese transport fleet would be much closer, and it's pretty big. Since the islands are fairly close, even some of the bigger landing craft or hovercraft could be used for the closest islands, and then again for island hopping to the next island. The Chinese Navy would very likely be able to provide support for those landings, and fend off any early blue side's counterattacks before the US manages to come in fully reinforced. The Okinawa base would too likely fall. The fact there's thousands of Marines there would be both a curse and a blessing. More troops means it would be harder to take, but so many troops on a not so large island means Chinese constant bombardment would decimate them before the landing does occur. The Russians up north would have a harder time. Their position is quite close to Japan. Japanese Hokkaido Island is in range of artillery from the Russian Kuril Islands. Russians currently have two garrisons nearby, numbering a few thousand troops. But Russians would have a harder time exploiting that proximity. The few transport ships they do have nearby would likely be better used to beef up those Kuril Island defenses, rather than attempt any attack on Hokkaido proper. Small islands of Rebun and Rishiri may get invaded though. The northern fleet ships would, as explained earlier, likely not be able to join the fleet. Even if they did, they would need a week or two to break through the northern ice route. The ace card the Russian side would play is their airborne assault force. It is the largest in the world. While most of it would still need a week or two to assemble and get to the Pacific front, it would be a threat to the Japanese troops, tracking them down throughout their mainland, as the blue side wouldn't know where they might try to land. Both Russian and Chinese airborne units use armored infantry fighting vehicles, giving them heavier platforms than what the blue side could muster in their airborne assault. A force actually trying to perform airborne assault where there is military superiority could be hugely damaging to those Russian forces. Even if part of the airborne troops do survive, they would be hard pressed from all sides and would probably be lacking supplies within a matter of days. There might be a better use of those airborne troops, aside for counterattacks if the US Marines try, after some weeks, to take some of the Kuril Islands. Russian airborne troops might help the Chinese effort. Assaulting Okinawa would certainly help the Reds' cause. Perhaps even some of the other middle Ryukyu islands could also be taken quickly. Chinese vast rocket artillery force, with their guided missiles as well as their sizable helicopter force, would make subsequent attacks on nearby islands easier. Russian assets could aid them as well. Another option, or even addition to those ops, would be assaults on Goto Islands and Tsushima Island, with the Chinese Navy support preventing the Blue Forces counterstrike and both Russian and Chinese air forces converging on those islands. Of course, the great proximity of those islands to the mainland Japan would mean those islands would more and more get attacked by the US forces, once the US Navy and Air Forces start coming to Japan in massive numbers. The mainland Japan would mostly be safe from invasions. Japanese air defenses are quite varied. Some US SAM units would already be present at the start, and more would be coming in each day via the US airlift effort. Both Japanese and US Patriot batteries feature anti-ballistic missile defenses, and both of their navies have ships with similar defense. While most of the red side's missiles would likely go through for attack, the overall effect of that rain of missiles would still be limited. There would be tens of thousands of tactical targets over Japan, not even counting the vehicle-sized army units. An order of magnitude less missiles going after them, and the fixed targets such as runways and depots would be repairable in time. So the red missile force would be a weapon of temporary effect, not something that would be much of a factor past the initial few weeks. The Japanese ground army is big enough to deal with any sort of landing force which would have to be equipped with comparatively lighter weapons. US Army additions would likely not even be that urgent. US airlift and sea lift capacity reinforcing Japan would initially, during the first month, be focused on additional air defenses and rapid reaction forces such as airborne assault units, in addition to more Navy ships and more Air Force planes. US Air Force reinforcements would also take up quite a bit of the airlift capacity, as each additional squadron of combat planes needs hundreds of personnel to support it and hundreds of tons of supplies. For the most part, US planes relocating to Japan would need support of aerial tankers, due to the vast distances involved. Luckily for the US, a vast tanker fleet is available, and it would work overtime to service both the incoming combat and transport planes. Progress of invasion would be of utmost importance for the Reds. As once US forces do relocate to Japan, the numbers would not be in Red's favor. Not only that, but the US ships are on average bigger and more capable, especially the carriers. The list shown doesn't include carriers unlikely to be available before summer of 2020 due to overhauls. Again, one Chinese carrier would be without planes, unless the Russian carrier-borne units somehow manage to do a crash course integration on it, which would still take at least weeks. US submarines are all nuclear and pretty advanced, while a lot of Red Side's nuke subs stem from Cold War technology, and most of the Red Side subs are non-nuclear subs anyway, more suitable to holding an area rather than going on attack. US expeditionary units alone are considerable and would eventually start taking back the northernmost Ryukyu Islands, though by then we're talking about 6 months into the war. The Chinese would likely get a chance to sail out of the first island chain before that, with their navy. But what would be the point? Going north to mainland Japan would only mean going into the concentration of enemy air and naval power. And as the Chinese Navy gets some 500 miles away from the mainland shores, it would lose the added protection of the Chinese air power. Even assuming China manages to operate many planes from the newly taken Ryukyu Islands, which would be questionable due to ever-growing US Air Force raids from Japan, there would still be some 900 miles left to get to Guam, for example. Assembling a big Chinese naval force to go towards Guam would be possible in theory, but it would likely be faced with several carriers and dozens to 100 of Guam-based planes, depending on how effectively the Chinese missile attacks could close those Guam airstrips. The Chinese submarine force would also be low in numbers, with Chinese conventional subs unsuited to the fast maneuvering warfare in the open ocean. So the Chinese would likely be outright defeated if they venture out to Guam. The US could afford to lose dozens of destroyers and a few carriers in a decisive battle, neutralizing most of the Chinese navy, if needed. The US wouldn't have it easy, of course, as their main weapon is still the old Harpoon anti-ship missile. The Chinese have increased their numbers of supersonic anti-ship missiles on ships and aircraft, though they may not get in range to make full use of them. Moving so far away from the Chinese coast would also mean no long-range anti-ship ballistic missiles for the Chinese. Would those missiles even be so deadly? Hard to say. Evidently, the ever more expanding anti-ballistic missile protection on US ships does suggest they're a valid threat. And over the last decade, the Chinese have expanded their aerial and space-based tracking assets. Today, their satellite fleet is far more potent than the Soviet Union's ever was for tracking of naval targets. But again, the closer to Chinese coastline the area of interest is, the less area there is to cover overall, making the job of tracking carrier groups 600 miles from China considerably easier compared to tracking them 2,000 miles away around Guam. Going after satellites opens up a whole new front, though, which may not be in the US interest. Using satellite navigation, for example, makes precision attacks very hard, which is something US would need if they're to take back the Japanese islands. If the US tries to go for the Chinese mainland coast, it would not only run into more Chinese coastal ships, but also into considerable Chinese air defense systems. Going after Russia would be somewhat easier. The area up north is bigger, and the concentration of military bases is far smaller on the Russian Pacific coast. While going after mainland proper would be probably out of the question, due to the combined Russian and Chinese ground forces, the distances between important areas are so big that the Reds would be hard-pressed to defend everything. Sakhalin Island is crucial for Russia. It would likely tie a lot of Russian defenses to it. But so are the Kuril Islands and Kamchatka. Not all three could be defended after months and months of US counterstrikes. The Kuril Islands in particular would be vulnerable once the Russians lose the control over the seas nearby. Launching attacks from Hokkaido would likely see the US taking most, if not all, of the Kurils by the end of the year one of the war. Chinese Air Force might help, but most of it would be tied defending the Ryukyu Islands. Down south, the Chinese bases in the South China Sea would be another area where US could go to, but it's possible those wouldn't be worth it. Those Chinese island bases are too far away from US bases. Projecting power that far onto enemy islands, which are pretty close to China itself, would be quite ineffective and would require too large of a force and too many casualties. More important for the US would be taking those Ryukyu Islands first, which again, due to the proximity of some of them to China, may not be possible within a year. A longer war past the one-year date would change the battlefield even more, but we're talking about mobilization of the whole industry and populations of entire countries by then, not just about initial military forces. All that is outside the scope of this video. Suffice it to say that even within the first year, the Red side's gains would be mostly temporary. Losses-wise, both sides would likely lose upward of 1,000 planes, and probably over 100 naval vessels each. Though as percentage of total forces, such losses would hit the Red side a bit harder, and Red side would lose some more ground troops while taking all the islands, in costly assaults. The Blue side retaking those islands would benefit from being able to wait out the enemy, once they're cut off from supplies. Given how the front line would mostly go back to where it was for China, and how Russia might even lose important islands, overall the US and Japanese side would come out of it all in somewhat better shape. Once again, thank you to GameLoft or Planet Online for sponsoring this video. Check out their link below. And remember, in COD we talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.
Tulog mo na yun. Tutulog na tayo, tutulog na.
Philippines orders to swarm and shoot any Chinese illegal fishing vessels roaming the disputed sea. China is facing a growing pushback from the Philippines in the South China Sea as the two countries assert their claims over a disputed gray zone in the waters. The Philippines is building up a greater sea-based military force, known as the Kapu Active Auxiliary Service, to defend waters it believes are within its control, analysts say. It follows similar moves by China in the region, in which small boats are increasingly used to intrude into waters claimed by the Philippines, according to Asia Times. Delfin Lorenzana, Defense Secretary for the Philippines, said in a recent government address that China uses civilian militias, which are acting as fishermen but are part of China's navy. However, it is thought the Philippines move could increase the risk of conflict in the South China Sea. This is despite the fact they will not be armed. Philippine Fleet Commander Lumar Bernabe told reporters recently, definitely, they will not be given firearms, according to Philippine news outlet Rearc. Instead, the sea-based forces would be given surveillance equipment and communications technology. Meanwhile, Professor Jay Batonga, a maritime affairs expert from the University of the Philippines College of Law, told the news outlet the CAAS forces would have to be carefully monitored in order to avoid unnecessary tensions in the region. He added, otherwise you might end up with vigilante-like groups or adventurers, which are not the kind of people you want in a tense disputed region. It is not the first time the CAAS has been referred to in recent times by Philippine officials. Only last week, the country's Navy Chief Vice Admiral Giovanni Carlo Ricordo referred to the militia as force multiplier. He appeared to distinguish between the Philippine CAAS, the Navy, and the country's Coast Guard. The Navy chief said, it's a stopgap measure to fill where we are not, where the Navy and where the Coast Guard are not. It is understood the CAAS forces will be trained by the nation's Navy. In 2016, Reuters reported China was providing military training to some of its fishing vessels to prepare to sail into the South China Sea. It involved instructions for fishing vessels to collect information on boats from other nations. An anonymous advisor to China's Hainan Island government said the maritime militia would be protecting our country's interests. Some of the boats were even reported to have small arms, containing fishermen allegedly dead. Meanwhile, the Philippines has said it will swarm fishing waters with boats after a government official said China is doing the same. Teodoro Locsin, Foreign Affairs Secretary for the Philippines, said this week, we are swarming the areas because that's the Chinese strategy, to swarm the areas also with the fishing boats. He also said the country could fall back on U.S. assistance if necessary.
Yung ano mo, yung steam mo.
The World Wildlife Fund has warned nearly 30% of fish stocks commercially fished are overfished.
Ay na.
Hello, hello, hello. Hello, how do you do? Mega, mega love that. 2 million people and that. Hello, mega mega love shout out dyan sa mga 2 million natin na tao dyan. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, how do you do?
And of course, careful and potatoes are just the key to always the Filipinos were aside from eating out, we were also find out to going and down by two on the 160,000, 130,000, up to 877 billion. This US was fighting for its own. On the other hand, the Japanese pilots were fighting what was regarded as the Empire's most dangerous, the Mitsubishi A610 on 7.7 million, two trailers with high explosive evidence and with an altitude of 533 kilometers. Zero was with the dominant sky to the descent with a final range of 1,870 feet. There was virtually no corner of the Pacific this terrible sky could not reach. But what made this deal even more dangerous were the pilots that do it, known as Ivan Volta. These pilots were seasoned aerial combat veterans of the Second Field of Japanese War. They were highly publicized as the Japanese people produced the best number of fighter aces. Among them were Hiroyoshi Ishikawa, 88 aerial victories, Sabo Taki with 64, and Toshio Ota, 34. The Japanese invaders had an advantage in number, performance, skill, and fire. All odds were stacked against Fillmore and 60 squadron. This didn't stop Fillmore. Other things in the fight from defending the motherland. Soon as Fillmore was right out of it, zero soldiers was just fighting. He quickly dove into the Messina valley to escape. The Philippines almost underground. Hitting the Daily News, blew through guns, even hit underneath high-tension power. Thankfully, he was able to break through and get killed. But just as he was about to come back up, another hero was hot. This time he was still back. Japanese pilots was closing in on him. As the enemy was lining up to fire, visible maneuvers into a half beat, Blake standing on his tail, then dropped snap hold for a reverse position. Both Blakes were now face to face. Fillmore quickly pulled the trigger and kept the zero still. 99 with zero first position. With zero still remaining, Filipino landed safely in Blanc Field. 2 days later, on December 12th, 27 Japanese bombers escorted 17 Japanese heroes with spotted quantities over the atmosphere, moved to a planned area. Again, Captain Fillmore witnessed and set the fire. With the president, Geronimo Manuel Bonte, and Antonio took off their people vividly. Vigilant flying to cover by a short burst, Japanese bombers bomb. To their surprise, saw smoke coming out from one of the bombers. It was Fillmore's second hit. The Japanese bomber climbed on broke mark. Zero quickly chased after the Filipinos. Basa tried to outmaneuver the team, but was no match. Fillmore saw something fast as one of them break off. The plane hit the ground. Later that day, Basa's body was found weeks away from his resting place. Beneath his parachute, riddled with bullets. Second October was the first Filipino pilot to down the aerial combat. He was awarded the Silver Star for his sacrifice. 6 days later, December 18, 1941, President Manuel Bonte, under executive order number 386, declared the Philippine flag reversed, red flag above, to indicate that the country was in a state of war. It was the first time since the Philippine-American War that the Philippine flag was kept inverted. By the end of December, overwhelmed by the Japanese assault, Lieutenant Colonel Carl Stack, the commanding officer of the Philippine Army Air, ordered Captain Fillmore to destroy all remaining evidence and to withdraw with the rest of the empire. Finding it hard to destroy the 11 Philippine pieces, the acting sergeant withdrawn to aircraft quarters. Already the Philippine Army Air Force was returning to ground training and going to the end of the island in 1988. For his exploits and heroism in aerial combat, Captain Fillmore was conferred the Distinguished Service Cross of the Silver Star, Field Marshal of the Philippine Army, and to honor its most famous pilot, the Philippine Air Force Unit 54th Air Division Company 6, Colonel Henry Fillmore Air Base, where the main headquarters of the Philippine Air Force is located today. You like our story? Comment below. If you have other heroic tales you want us to feature, let us know. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe.